Chapter 17. Chapter 17 is one of the largest chapters in the book of Samuel, and perhaps the most well-known story in the book, the battle between David and Goliath. Verses 1. And the Philistines assembled their camps to war, and they assembled at Shochosh, which belonged to Judah, and they encamped between Shochosh and Azekah in Ephes-Dammaim. For reasons that are unclear from anything in the text, not here or later on, the Philistines are swiftly gathered to go to war, and they gather in Shochosh, which is in Judah. They are camped between Shochosh and further south of Azekah in an area called Ephes-Dammaim. The name Ephes-Dammaim literally means no blood, no blood. This may be a name that was given to this place after this battle, which is going to be described later. Indeed, no blood had been shed there for most of the time that they were camped there. It is important to know a little bit of the geography of this place. From the coastal cities, specifically from Gath, which is a little bit inland where the famous giant Goliath comes from, this area is southwest of Jerusalem in an area called Emek HaElah, that is the Valley of Elah. It is a series of low hills that form canyons, ravines, or wadis between them. One can walk directly from Gath to this place just by following the wadi, that is the valley. This will be important for the direction of retreat at the end of this chapter and the beginning of chapter 18. This is important because we see a retreat. This location is going to be important for the direction of retreat at the end of this chapter and then the beginning of chapters 18. In any case, this was where the Philistines marched to, which puts them squarely underneath the hills that include Bethlehem, squarely to the west, but downhill, meaning underlooking or overseen by Bethlehem. This is very important. This is how it looks like. This is the geography of the place. The Philistines marched to the valley, which puts them squarely underneath the hills that include Bethlehem. Squarely to the west, but downhill, meaning underlooked or overseen by Bethlehem. Now, one of the critical problems foreshadowed here is the problem of the sequence of the text. In chapter 16, we met David, his brothers, his father, and we saw David taken into Saul's palace or house, and David becomes Saul's weapon carrier, etc. In this chapter, it is almost as if we have never heard of chapter 16. We will deal with this at the end of the chapter and try to make sense out of it. Verses 2. And Saul and the men of Israel assembled, and they encamped in the valley of Terebinth, and they set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines were standing on the mountain from here, and Israel was standing on the mountain from here, and the valley was between them. They were standing on one mountain opposite the other, and the valley was in the middle. The mountain of Shochosh faces the hill, which today is referred to as Kibbutz Halamed Hey, meaning the kibbutz of the 35. This is where Israel camped, and in the middle is a valley that is known as Wadi Sumt. Wadi Sumt, the Valley of Sumt. This is the name of the ravine in the middle, and it goes pretty much parallel to the road which goes in between those two hills. Verses 4. And the champion emerged from the Philistines' camp, named Goliath from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. The guy who goes out is the middleman. We are told his name is Goliath. However, throughout nearly all of the narrative, he is not called by name, but rather the Philistine. For some reasons that we will get to only at the end of 2 Samuel, we will have to cast some doubt as to the identity of this giant because of the mention of another Goliath who is defeated in a separate battle. The question is whether or not this giant really had some other name, and somehow the name Goliath got pinned on him in the 1 or 2 times it is mentioned in association with the fact that he comes from the town of Gath. He's called Goliath from Gath. Goliath's height could be anywhere between 8.5 feet and 10 feet tall. The text is giving us a sense of his exact height, which is humongous, of course, even in the modern world and certainly in the ancient world. What is it that the children of Israel see when he came out? Verse 5. And a helmet of copper was on his head, and he was wearing a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of copper. Verse 6. And greaves of copper were on his leg, and a copper javelin was between his shoulders. Verse 7. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head was 600 shekels of iron. And the shield bearer went before him. This giant is carrying a huge, heavy load just on his body. And he has a fellow walking in front of him carrying a shield to protect the lower part of his body. This makes him basically impregnable. But on the other hand, so what? It is just one guy. We are talking about the Philistine army against the Israelite army. So why be afraid of him? Now what happens when he walks out? Verses 8. And he stood and called to the array of Israel, and he said to them, Why should you come out to wage war? Am I not the Philistine? And you the servants of Saul? Choose for yourself a man, and let him come down to me. He turns this war into a mano a mano, a man-on-man, a one-on-one battle with the following consequence. Verses 9. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, we shall be slaves to you. And if I overcome him and kill him, you shall be slaves to us and serve us. Notice he does not say the same thing in the first half of the clause, because in his mind it is just an impossibility. The real question that is not answered at all is why would the Israelite army and Saul buy into this? Why did they not say they are not interested? Somehow he has them tantalized and paralyzed with his threats and taunts to the point that they do not have any response. You don't have to agree to the terms. Verses 10. And the Philistine said, I taunt the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, and let us fight together. I have shamed the army of Israel this day. He has turned the war that may have been political, territorial, and may be issues of control into a personal affront. I have shamed you. Send out one guy and let's go at it. Verse 11. And Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, and they were panic-stricken and very much afraid. It is very hard to imagine that the Israelite army, who had extensive interactions with the Philistines from past battles, would suddenly think that all of the Philistines were dressed in a similar manner and that they were all tall and strong. They have to have understood that this was a unique character that they had never had contact with before. If they were to go to war, he would be one of their significant players. And for some reason, the Israelites became very paralyzed by his words. He's going to be one of the significant players. But you have the numbers to defeat him. There is one idea in his words that I want to take another look at. He says, I have embarrassed, I have shamed the armies of Israel. How did he shame the armies of Israel? What did he say? What did he do that was so shameful? What is the author trying to communicate to us about the claim made by Goliath, and what did he do? In the meantime, we are introduced to a character we know all too well. David, son of Jesse. Verses 12. And David was the son of this Ephrathite man from Bethlehem of Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man was old in Saul's time, coming among men. One new piece of information that we are told about Jesse is that he is old. He is coming on in years, which is a biblical idiom that means close to death. Verses 13 and 14. And Jesse's 3 eldest sons who had followed Saul went to war, and the names of his 3 sons who went to war were Eliab the firstborn, and the second to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. We hear about the 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. We hear about son number 8, David. But the middle sons we hear nothing about because they are really inconsequential to the story. Verses 14 repeats what we have already read in verse 13. The 3 went out and David did not. It is setting up an opposition that the 3 are the 3 heroes of the family. They are the 3 elders that are going out to war, and David, in the meantime, does not go out to war. Verses 15. Now David went to and fro from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. David is going back and forth from shepherding his father's flock above Saul, meaning he is shepherding at a location above where the Israelite army is camped. From this vantage point, he can see what is going on at the front of the battle. It's important. The geography here is very important. Verse 16. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. Goliath is addressed as the Philistine. Verses 17 and 18. And Jesse said to David his son, Take now to your brothers an ephah of this parched corn and 10 loaves of this bread, and rush them to the camp to your brothers. And you shall bring these 10 cheeses to the captain of the 1,000, and you shall see how your brothers are faring, and you shall take the tidings of their welfare. An ephah is about 30 kilograms of toasted corn and 10 loaves. Your brothers have been at war for 40 days, and you have to go bring some provisions and bring back a sign or a guarantee that they are alive. Jesse parenthetically demonstrates what we have already seen when he sends David to Saul. He has a sense of diplomatic acumen and a sense of protocol. When he sent David to Saul, he sent a bunch of food as a gift. Now he is not only sending a care package to his sons at war, but he is also sending what we would call, in camp terms, a tip to the general who is in charge of them, which will ensure, of course, that they would probably be treated better than the other soldiers. Verses 19. And Saul and they and all the men of Israel in the valley of the Terebinth were at war with the Philistines. Now this is an ironic and sort of a sardonic statement. They are not fighting. They are not doing anything. They have their tails between their legs and they are listening to the Philistine threaten them day in and evening out. They are doing nothing. But officially, they are at war. What war? Interesting. Verses 20 and 21. And David arose early in the morning, and he left the sheep with the keeper, and he carried off and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the barricade, and the army which was going out to the battle array shouted in the battle. And the Israelites and the Philistines put the battle in array, army against army. David is presented very much in the text as a latter-day Joseph. Scorned by his brothers and separated perhaps because he has a different mother, he is not connected. His brothers do not give him any regard. Of course, in the story of Joseph, they regarded him all too well, but they certainly distanced themselves from him, and he ends up being an outcast. Here, there is another parallel with Joseph in that Joseph's father sent him to his brothers who are in a safe place. In this case, David is sent to his brothers who are endangered or engaged in war in a dangerous situation. We find that David's brothers do not take very kindly to David's presence, thinking him to be uppity, which is very much reminiscent of Joseph's brothers and their attitude towards him. Also, like Joseph, David proves his worth and position in the family. David goes and sees the two camps facing each other. He sees the circles or the barricades, and what does he hear? Verse 22. And David left the baggage in the hand of the keeper of the baggage, and he ran to the battle array, and he came and greeted his brothers. He ran out to the front to look for his brothers to see if they were okay. Of course, why wouldn't they be okay? No one is fighting. Verses 23. And while he was speaking with them, behold, the champion, named Goliath the Philistine, from Gath, was coming from the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke the same words as before. And David heard. Now, for the second time, we are told what the Philistine's name is: Goliath of Gath, which indeed has a certain rhyme to it. And that seems to be what David is thinking. Who is this guy coming out called Goliath of Gath? Verse 24. And all the men of Israel, upon seeing the man, fled from before him, and were exceedingly frightened. Here's David. He is a young man. He goes to the battlefront and sees that in spite of all of the legendary soldiers of Saul, they allow Goliath to denigrate them, and they all ran away. Verse 25. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who is coming up? For he is coming up to taunt Israel. And it will be that the man who will kill him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and he will give him his daughter, and he will make his father's house free in Israel. The person who defeats this giant will be free of paying taxes in Israel. This is the meaning of the phrase, free in Israel. There is great reward waiting. The king is clearly desperate, so he has put up 3 great rewards for anyone who successfully goes into the ring and takes Goliath out. David heard this, but perhaps he wanted them to say it again, or maybe he was not clear on what he heard, or possibly he wanted to hear something else. I will make a suggestion in a second. Verse 26. And David said to the men who were standing before him, saying, What shall be done to the man who slays the Philistine, and takes away reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the ranks of the living Yah, or living Elohim? David asks a question that he knows the answer to, but ends with something very powerful. He says, and takes away reproach from Israel. He said, What shall be done to the man who slays that Philistine and takes away reproach from Israel? This is David's take, and it is very important to note what he added in. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine who has shamed the armies of the living Elohim? David has therefore now broadcasted to anyone who is listening that there is a new kid in town, and this kid is in the camp. Not only does he seem not to be afraid, but he's also getting the word out that the issue should not be about the wealth and the reward, but the issue should be the relief of the overall shame of the armies of Israel. I think it's brilliant. Verses 27 to 29. And the people said to him, So shall be done to the man who slays him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man, and Eliab's wrath was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the desert? I know your impetuousness and the evil of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the war." And David said, "What have I done now? Is it not but a word?" David gives an answer to his brother Eliab, which is somewhat cryptic. It could be read as, "It really is something, is it not? This war is not so bad to come down and see it." Or it may mean, "I just spoke. I just said words. Why are you getting on my case? All I asked was a question and made a comment." Verse 30. And he turned around from him toward another, and he spoke according to the same manner. The people answered according to the former manner. David already has the information, so why does he keep asking? He asks because he wants Saul to hear about this. He wants Saul to know that someone has come into the camp that is ready to do battle. He wants to put the word out. Verse 31. And the words which David had spoken were heard, and they related them before Saul, and he took him. If you can imagine from Saul's perspective, suddenly there is a breath of fresh air. Out of the blue, someone is in the camp that is ready to consider going into the ring with Goliath. Verses 32 and 33. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your bondsman will go and battle with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are unable to go to this Philistine to battle with him, for you are a lad, and he is a warrior since his youth. You are just a child, and he has been a man of war since he was a young man." Now, of course, this very much upsets the sequence of the text in which David, in the previous chapter, was already assigned the position of Saul's weapons carrier. This should have been at the beginning the entire time. David was already described as a man of war and a valiant fighter in the previous chapter, and here Saul, who may or may not have known him, says, "You are just a child, and he's a soldier." So David tells a story. Chapters 34 to 36. And David said to Saul, "Your bondsman was a shepherd of sheep for his father, and there came a lion and also a bear and carried off a lamb from the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and saved it from his mouth. And he arose upon me, and I took hold of his jaw, and I smote him and slew him. Both the lion and the bear has your bondsman slain, and the uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he taunted the armies of the living Elohim." The episodes of the lion and the bear are two different stories. David, at the end of his story, seems to still emphasize the shaming of Israel by this Philistine. David makes this argument, which is an interesting one. And notice the next verse, verse 37, starts with, "And David said," which is strange because David is talking and there has been no action in the middle. So why does it say, "And David said"? David narrates his story and he anticipates that Saul will respond. But Saul is silent and he does not respond. David continues speaking. The text telegraphs that there was some sort of anticipated response or some sort of a break in the middle by adding, and David said again. There's a break in the middle. So the text adds, and David said. David was anticipating something, a response from Saul, but that response did not come. Verse 37, and David said, Yah who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will save me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and may Yah be with you. David adds a statement to his initial narrative that prompts Saul to respond. He said, Yah, who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. Saul understood that this young man may be great, but if he does not understand that Yah is a central part of his victory, we are not going anywhere. So as long as David says, I beat the lion, I beat the bear, Saul said nothing. David understood this, so he rephrased it and said, Yah who saved me from the bear, from the lion. Then Saul engaged him with a response, Go, and may Yah be with you, because that is the way you will be saved. Verse 38, and Saul dressed David with his garments, and he placed a copper helmet on his head, and he dressed him with a coat of mail. This is very symbolic of Saul taking the royal battle garb and putting it on David. Again, David is becoming the king here, although nobody seems to be aware of it. Verses 39 to 40. And David gathered his sword over his garments, and he did not want to go in them, for he was not accustomed. And David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I am not accustomed. And David took them off, and he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth pebbles from the brook, and he placed them in the shepherd's bag which he had, and in the sack, and his slingshot was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. David was a shepherd who was used to having on very little garments as he ran. He took off the armor and took a stick in his hands. We have to imagine that Goliath is watching this. He went down to the riverbed, which is between them. There is a ravine, which means the battle is undoubtedly taking place in the summertime. It is a riverbed, which means there is water there. So the rocks in the riverbed are going to be smooth rocks. Smooth rocks mean aerodynamic rocks that will fly swiftly because they will not have anything dragging them down. Plainly, he had some sort of a pouch, and he placed the rocks in the pouch. Goliath did not see it. A slingshot is not like what we may have seen in the old Dennis the Menace cartoon, but rather it is a pouch that has 2 strings. A string coming out from each side, and the 2 strings are held together. In the pouch, a little rock or pallet is placed, and the whole piece is swung together. Then at the critical moment, one of the string is let go and the entire thing opens up. If the user knows how to aim, it will go very far and it can do severe damage. David approaches the Philistine, and now we are getting to the critical meeting point.